Hey guys, I just wanted to do a quick introduction to this week's Bible study video. If you weren't able to join us, here it is. We're starting in the book of John, going verse by verse. We started with chapter 1, verse 1, and worked through verse 14. In this Bible study, I shared some thoughts, and so did some of the ladies that were able to join us. If you weren't able to join us, we missed you and hope to see you next week when we're going to pick up where we left off with verse 15. And I'll send it when I send my email out on Monday. I'll let you guys know which verses we're going to look at so that you can go ahead and look at them. But you can start with what we went through if you weren't with us on Tuesday. And then if you want to start reading at verse 15, we'll go through, I don't know, 10 or 12 verses. We'll just kind of see what makes sense. So hope to see you on Tuesday. And if not, join us when you can. If you have other nurses that you know that could benefit from this Bible study, do me a favor, send them to restoringnurses.com/social, where they can get the link to sign up so that they can join us at some point in the future. I love you guys. I hope that today's Bible study speaks to you. All right, cool. So we're recording. So, like I said, we're in the book of John. I always, when I'm doing Bible study, I like to know a little bit about the book itself and about who wrote it. So this is written by John, who was one of the disciples of Jesus. It was written around 85 AD, so about 50 years after Jesus was crucified. So John is thinking back as he's writing this to his time with Jesus and writes his gospel. One thing that's important to remember as we're reading the gospels is that each of the four gospels were written by different authors and for different audiences. So they each had. So as we read, sometimes you'll read some of the stories in the Gospels, and people say, "Okay, but this says something this one doesn't say, so therefore it can't be true." Well, that's not really fair, because if we were to witness, the three of us that are here were to witness an event, and you come up to me and ask me to tell the story of that event, I'm going to say the pieces of it that were important to me. And Dewan and Nicola would do the same thing. We're going to so our stories would be a little different, even though it was the same event. Um, the other thing is the way we told that story would depend on who we were talking to. So in this case, John was writing specifically for people that didn't know Jesus. So what we'll read in this first chapter here, the first part of this chapter 1, is John introducing us to who Jesus was. So I'm going to read it, and then we'll talk. I'll share some thoughts about it, and then we'll have some discussion. Starting in verse 1, going to read through to verse 13. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Hey, Jonil, welcome. We're just getting started. We're chapter 1, John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that was created. Life was in him, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness did not overcome it. Let's actually talk about that section first, and then we'll move into verse 6. So John writes here, in the beginning was the Word, and he is using the same phrase that we find in Genesis 1:1, where we read, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It's that same phrase. So John, talking to Jews, they would have been very familiar with that phrase. Okay, so they're trying to tell him who Jesus is, or he's trying to tell them who Jesus is. So he's going back to the very beginning. In the beginning, it says, was the Word. Now, in my translation, the word word is capitalized. Okay. I think it probably is in most translations. And hey, Lindsay, welcome back. Um, And I said, Lindsay, you were with us last week, right?
I was.
Okay. I recognize you have an unusual spelling, so that's how but I like
Yes,
it.
it's because my grandmother says my mother cannot spell.
I like it. I like it. So, Lindsay, I just read verses John 1, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and talking about it a little bit. So when so the word there, word, is referring to Jesus, and you say, okay, how Matt, how do you know that that's referring to Jesus? And if we kind of fast forward a little bit, we go down to verse 14 in the same chapter. It says this: the word became flesh and took up residence among us. So there it's using the same word that gets translated here as word. It's actually logos in the Greek. Um, but the logos, the word became flesh and took up residence among us. So Jesus, obviously, we know was born to Mary, became flesh and blood, and lived on earth as one of us. Okay. So there, John makes it pretty clear in verse 14 that when he says the word, he's talking about Jesus. Okay. But he goes on to say, in the beginning was the word. So the word was there. It's not saying that Jesus became, that he uh began at the beginning. He's saying he was, indicating that he already was there. Okay. So consider we were at a sporting event together, and or we're talking about a sporting event that I was in attendance. And you ask me, did you see the play that happened early in the game? Okay. And I say I was there. We wouldn't assume that I just suddenly appeared at the beginning of the game. We would assume that I already existed, but then was present in that event. And that's what John is saying when he says, in the beginning was the Word. The Word, Jesus, he already existed in the beginning. Okay. He goes on saying, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So he's very clearly saying that Jesus was with God and was God. So he's beginning to point to what we call now the Trinity, the multiple separate persons of God, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. Because you can't be with yourself and also be yourself, right? The other thing about the word with there that gets translated with, which is not a very meaningful word for us, but the original word there actually tells of a close relationship. So Jesus had a close relationship with God, not simply he was present. Verse 2, he was with God in the beginning. John is repeating what he just said in verse 1. In the Bible, any time that there is repetition, the writer is telling us this piece is important. Okay. So anytime you see repetition like that, John is wanting us to know, hey, Jesus was there in the beginning. Okay. It's also worth noting there, some may try to say that the word doesn't refer to a person, but in verse 2, John refers to the word as he. So clearly, John is personifying the word. He's saying the word is a person, which he later tells us was a person who became flesh and lived among us. So, verse 3, all things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. Sorry, I'm scrolling through my notes here. When it says here, all things, it literally means all things. Okay. I love to look at what the Greek means, and I read a number of different commentaries on such things. But here, when it says all things, it literally means all things. And it doesn't just mean all things that were created in the beginning, in the creation story that we read up in Genesis. it means all things that have been created since then as well. Okay, so us, even, right? And apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. When we read the creation story in Genesis, it said God said, "Let there be light." Okay, and some people read that and think that it means that God spoke and the power of his voice made it happen. Others believe that God spoke because of what John says here, that everything was created through Jesus. Then others think that God the Father spoke to Jesus and then Jesus went out and made it happen. The reality is, I don't know. Both of those are possible. Okay. I do believe that God has the power to simply speak things into existence. At the same time, the Father has the authority to say to Jesus, "Hey, go create light," right? But the difficulty is that when we read God said, "Let there be light." If Jesus is God, God the Father is God, God the Holy Spirit is God, then we don't know which person of the Trinity is the one that said, "Let there be light." Okay. Reading through the rest of the creation story, it almost appears as if it's all three of them. Because later it says, when he creates man, he says, "Let us create man in our own image." So the translation I'm using, again, it's the Christian Standard Bible. It says all things were created through him. Some translations do say all things were created by him. So again, it kind of complicates the how that relationship and that function actually worked. But the main thing to remember is that it all happened, that Jesus was part of creating it all. Verse 4, life was in him. Earlier, when John said, use the word was, he was in the beginning, he's indicating eternality. So Jesus always had existed. Here he's saying the same thing, that life was in him, that life had always been in Jesus. Jesus was the source of life. He created all things, including humans. All the things he created received life from him. Because when we read about how he created Adam, again, in the creation story in Genesis, it says that he molded him from the clay, but it was still not alive until God breathed into him. So Adam received life along with all the other created things, plants or animals. They all received life from the source of life, which is Jesus. And it's important. We'll talk a little bit more about why it's important that Jesus is the source of life in just a minute. Oh, actually, it's right now. I put all these notes together, and then sometimes they get a little scrambled in my brain. So, okay, the Greek word that's used here as life. Now we probably think when we read that of physical life, especially as nurses, because that's what we're all about, is physical life, right? But the Greek word here is used throughout much of the rest of the New Testament to actually refer to eternal life. So, yes, it does refer to physical life, as in the creation story, but it also refers to eternal life that comes from Jesus Christ. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Continuing in verse 5, and it said, or verse 4, rather, and that life was the light of men. Like I just said, that doesn't refer to natural life, okay? Because we read in the creation story that the sun, moon, and stars, God created those things to provide natural light. So what is this light that John's referring to here? He was the light of men. And that's where I believe, as I read this, John is saying Jesus is the source of our salvation. Because remember, he's laying a foundation for people that don't yet know Jesus, people who are not saved, or as the Bible refers to them, people who are lost. So he's laying a foundation here that Jesus is the light, Jesus is the source of salvation. I'm skimming through my notes. Another thing about light, and this is something that I've said many times over the years, and it's funny, I was reading one of the commentaries as I was preparing for this, and the commentator said the same thing. As we read into verse 5, it says that light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness did not overcome it. Your translation may say receive. There's a few different words that can be translated from the Greek word that's used there. The funny thing about darkness is it doesn't actually exist. Darkness is simply the absence of light. You know, I could turn off this light and this room would get darker, but I haven't actually added darkness to it. I've removed light. Okay. Think of it like this bottle. All right. To empty this bottle, I have to actually remove the water from it. Now, I could take an air compressor and squirt air in there. I can add air to that, but darkness is simply the absence of light. So this is encouraging to me, because if Jesus is the light of men, then when we experience dark times, which we all do, right? Then we have to ask ourselves, have we become separated from Jesus? Now, I will caveat that with saying I am not one who believes that we can lose our salvation. Okay, so I'm not saying we get separated in that we lose our relationship with Jesus. I can still be married to my wife, but we can drift apart to our relationship is not as close as it is. And I think the same thing can happen with Jesus. And sometimes when we get into these dark times in our lives, that's what's happening. All right. Now, sometimes it's like we talked about last week in Mark chapter 6, where Jesus sends us out into a storm, knowing the storm is coming. So sometimes the dark times are God preparing us for something, God testing us. Sometimes that's what it is. Sometimes it's just that we have drifted away from Jesus. So I say all that to encourage you, if when we enter those dark times, take it as a cue to seek Jesus. Okay. Me and Joe Neal kind of talked some last week about how we found ourselves doing all these things and realizing we weren't doing, we had drifted, you know. And it's kind of funny. Our natural tendency is to drift away from Jesus, because our flesh wants to drift away from Jesus. So when that happens, don't beat yourself up. Just get back in the boat and row back up to Jesus. And the funny thing is, when I did I did children's ministry for a bunch of years in church, and in children's church, what I would do is I would have a kid walk away from me, and I would walk right behind them, and then I would say, okay, now turn around. And what I was teaching them with that was that no matter how far they walked, all they ever had to do was turn around and I was there. And that's how it is with Jesus. That was what I was teaching them, was that even when we're running away from Jesus with all of our might, which we do sometimes in life, all we have to do is turn around and he's right there. He always has been.
You know, Matt, a lot of people have that sense that why did God let this happen? Why? Why? And I think that's a time when you have to say, I don't know why. It
Yeah.
just did. It just did happen. And not to that to blame God. And it's easy to say, why would God let murders and
Yeah.
floods and earthquake quakes and my child to get this and my child to get that? And that's that time when it is easy if you really believe that God was so evil that he would do that to you. And instead of saying, no, this is all God's still here in the midst of
Yeah.
it. And that has been something that I had to learn the hard way.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that, Joe Neal. That's awesome. And anybody here, if you have something to interject while we're going through it, just come off mic and add your thoughts. I love that. Um, Keep in mind we are recording, so if it's something private, that you wait till the end when we get to the that part, because I will stop the recording for anybody to share something more intimate or private. Um, but but yeah, I love that, Joe Neal. The reality is, we oftentimes we don't know, and I've looked at folks that say that have asked me that as a pastor. I've had folks ask me, why would God allow this thing to happen? And sometimes I can see from the outside looking in why he may have done it, but even in then, I'm just trying to guess what a God that is infinitely greater than I might be doing. You know, I love. There's a passage, and I can't remember where it is right off the top of my head, where it talks about when we get to heaven. It says, "In that day, we will know, even as we have been known." And I love that because what I really believe is that in that moment, we're going to look back on those moments, like you just mentioned, Joe Neal, and we're going to go, "Oh, okay, I get it now." Because we're going to have this knowledge that we just don't have now. Um, that's awesome. Yeah.
I was wondering if I could add that
Sure.
I have heard in the past that light equals knowledge. And I thought that might be worth mentioning too,
Yes.
because, he brings the light, and with that, he brings knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nicola. That's absolutely correct. In some of the um, commentaries I was reading preparing for this, they made that same comment there, that light is also throughout the Bible used to talk about knowledge or understanding or discernment. Okay, so same thing. The Still, John is telling us that that's our source. That if we want knowledge, if we want wisdom, if we want understanding, if we want discernment, then do we all understand what I mean? Well, I'm going to explain what discernment is for anybody that might watch this later that might not know. Discernment. I'm going to use a very earthly example, but you ever met somebody and you just, every word they said, you just like, I don't believe anything this person is saying. And maybe you can't explain why. There's nothing, I mean, but there's just something in you that goes, no, that is discernment. Okay. When you're when you're at the used car lot and the car looks beautiful, but there's something, something about the guy selling it to you that's like, I just can't buy a car from this dude. That is discernment. Okay. And as Nicola pointed out, light, if Jesus is the light for man, then he's our source for discernment and knowledge and all that. And that's a common term throughout society as well. We're going to shine a little light on it. Spidey sense. Joe Neal said in the comment, Spidey sense. Exactly. We talk about shining a light on something. That means we're going to look at it and to understand it better, or we talk about becoming enlightened. So you're absolutely right, Nicola. And John is talking about that here as well. That's why I love Bible study, because you can read it and get a lot from it, but then when you really start to kind of dig into it, you realize sometimes it's way more complex. And John's really good at that. It can be deeper, but it's also simple. So, reading along in verse 6, there was a man named John who was sent from God. Now, this is the book of John. It was written by John the apostle, but he's not talking about himself there. Okay. He's talking about John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, as some would call him. So that's important to note, because as we read in the through these next few verses, those verses apply to John the Baptist, not to the author of this book. So, verse 7, he came as a witness to testify about the light so that all might believe through him. Testifying about the light, so he's talking about Jesus, not just Jesus, but if the light talks about salvation, then John the Baptist came to talk about Jesus and salvation through Jesus. Verse 8, he was not the light. That is also important because a lot of people, when John came around, wanted to make him the Messiah. They thought that he might have been the Messiah that they'd been waiting for hundreds and, well, thousands of years, really, throughout most of the Old Testament. But he was not the light. So John the Baptist says, no, I am not the Messiah. John the Apostle is saying here as well that he was not the light, but came to testify about the light. He came to talk about Jesus. The true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. So John was sent out to do, when he started preaching, he specifically was sent out to tell people that Jesus was coming. Now, verse 9 is a verse that can kind of get us in trouble sometimes. The true light who gives light to everyone. The problem with that, the difficulty with that verse is, if light is salvation, then this verse can be taken to mean that everyone gets salvation. Okay? But as we read further, we're going to see why that's not true. So the true light who gives light to everyone was coming into the world. Verse 10, he was in the world, the world.
So I have the King James Study Bible.
Yes.
And I'm going to take us back to 4 and 5. It says, in John's writings, life represents salvation and deliverance through Christ, and light denotes Jesus's revelation of God, which calls men to accountability. So that is the Study Bible's description of those. When you get to 9, it said, lighteth every man means that God's revelation is universally available, but does not signify universal salvation.
That's perfect, Lindsay. That's exactly what I was getting at. Some people will read that and try and say that everybody gets, but what Lindsay points out here, and which I agree with very much, is that it means that everybody has the opportunity. It's presented to everyone. Okay. But it's a gift. And the thing about a gift is it has to be received. So think about, as a nurse, if I'm taking care of a patient, and I've had this happen, they appreciate the care and they try to give me a tip. Well, most employers will not allow that, and frankly, it feels a little weird to me anyway. I've received a bunch of gifts from patients, cookies and whatnot, and I'll take that. We'll work for food, but but when I've had them try and give me cash, I've had to decline that. I've had to refuse that gift. Does my refusal of the gift negate their attempt to give it to me? Does it negate the offer? Obviously not. They still, the offer was still there. They still had a desire for me to receive this good thing, and they willingly offered it to me, but I refused it. And it's the same way with salvation, which when we read a little further, we'll see that it has to be received. So let's keep reading. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, talking again back to the earlier verses in this same chapter. Yet the world did not recognize him. I know we got multiple different translations here. What are some of the other translations? What word do they use there in verse 11 instead of recognize? Verse 10,
Mine
rather.
says new. Knew.
Okay.
I've got the Life Application Bible, and it says recognize as well.
Okay. I'm looking. I've got a couple of different translations here on my computer. Yeah, NIV says didn't recognize him. What does King James say, Nicola? Did you say it said no? Didn't know him?
Sorry, mine is the Life Application Bible, and it
Oh,
said
I'm sorry.
to recognize. Yeah.
Oh, Lindsay was the one with the King James. Um, yeah, I've got the New King James here. It says recognize.
Yeah,
I know
and
it says no.
well, in 11 it says his own received him not.
Right. That's where we really, and that's what mine says in verse 11 as well. So in verse 11 it says he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Okay. So this is where we're talking. This is where we begin to see that verse 9 is not saying that salvation is that automatic for everyone, because these folks didn't. It says they didn't receive him. If we keep reading, in verse 12 it says, but to all who did receive, he gave them the right to be children of God. That's another thing that sometimes we get twisted. Um, we all want to say that we're all children of God. And if that's true, then we don't need something to give us the right to be called children of God, right? Now, we're all wonderfully and fearfully made. We're all created in the image of God. We're all loved by God. The Bible's very clear on these things. Saved or not saved, those things all remain true. But the ones that are called children of God, are those who receive Jesus. Now, is that horribly sad? Yes, it is. I wish that all could be children of Jesus, but many, unfortunately, refuse that offered gift. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right, verse 12, to be children of God, to those who believed in his name, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. John kind of doubles down right there, where he's saying those who receive Jesus get the right to be called children of God, and then specifically says not who are born, but not of blood or of flesh, the will of flesh, or the will of man. So it's simply being born doesn't make you a child of God, is what John is saying there. We have to be born of God, born again, as Jesus explains to Nicodemus in another passage. Let me pull my notes back up real quick. So the bad news is not everybody gets to be a child of God. Okay. But the good news is everybody can. The light is offered, and like it says in verse 9, who gives light to everyone, gives them the revelation of Jesus. As Lindsay pointed out, and when we talk about the revelation of Jesus, it is revealing that Jesus was the Messiah, that he is the Son of God, and therefore has the ability to say to offer salvation. Verse 14, and we'll probably actually stop there. Verse 14 says, the word became flesh and took up residence among us. We already kind of talked about that when we look at verse 1, where John says, in the beginning was the word. If we fast forward to 14, the word became flesh and took up residence among us. That seems pretty clear to refer to Jesus. Okay. We're talking about someone who was with God, who was God, and became flesh. Then to me, that equates to Jesus. Who we observed his glory, the glory of the one and only Son from the Father. That's another important note there, the one and only Son, because there are several other places In fact, the most famous verse of all, John 3:16, refers to Jesus as the one and only, right? So John here says that the word is the one and only, and then later in chapter 3 he again says, referring to Jesus as the one and only. So it seems pretty clear to me that when John says the word, he's talking about Jesus, from the Father, full of grace and truth. Oh, there's more chat. NIV says recognize. Thank you, Dewan. So this is kind of a small world moment. You know how nursing is. Dewan is a nurse that I worked with in the ER. It feels like a very long time ago. I remember when she was just a baby nurse. Okay, I'm going to actually stop the recording unless anybody has anything
Okay,
to
wait,
add.
before you do that.
Okay.
So my study portion says made flesh indicates the incarnation of God the Son. The use of flesh contradicts the Gnostic heresy that God could not be united with human flesh, which was seen as evil. Dealt among us, John uses the word tabernacled, here translated to dwelt. In the Old Testament, tabernacle was where God dealt among the Jews in the wilderness. In this context, God is dwelling in the person of Jesus Christ. We behold his glory. Perhaps John refers to the Shihai glory which appeared at the tabernacle of the Old Testament. So that is its description of that verse.
That's good. I've actually got a King James study Bible over there on my shelf. I probably need to pull it out and look at it when I'm prepping for this. But that's good because the all of what you just talked about, that from the Old Testament, from the Israelites in the wilderness with the tabernacle, and the guided by a pillar of cloud in the day and a pillar of flame by night. All of that is things that John's Jewish audience would have been very familiar with. So when he says we observed his glory, then they would be familiar with what he's referring to. We might not be that familiar with it, but we have to remember he wasn't writing to Matt Norman in 2025. He was writing to Jews in 85 AD or thereabouts. So everything that Lindsay just talked about, they would have automatically recognized when John mentioned that. That's really good. Anything else that anybody would like to add before I stop the recording?